You don't know who has the expertise. You don't know who has the skill set. You don't know who's successfully in that space. The distributors do. And so what ends up happening is you end up relying on, as you begin your journey, the distributor to help you build out that go-to-market strategy. And part of that assistance is the identification of who are the partners in the ecosystem that I ought to be working with, right? And so that's kind of where it starts.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for tuning into Channel Voices, the podcast for future channel leaders, where we learn the ins and outs of partner ecosystems through casual conversations with channel professionals from a variety of industries, partner types, and geographies. My name is Maciek, and I'm your host. Frank Vitagliano, welcome to Channel Voices.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. When we typically kick this off, we'd like to know a little bit more about you and specifically a little bit more about your channel background. So could you give us a short description about your career to date in the channel, please?
Yeah, and I'll do the best to keep it short because it's been a long time. Yeah, I started in the industry back in the frankly the early '70s with IBM, and it was obviously different back then. The IT business was different back then, so it was with what IBM was doing back then, which was one of the predominant, as you know, one of the predominant IT companies, in the '70s and '80s, and frankly right now too, I think. But anyway, I started with IBM early on. Had a number of different jobs, all tended to be in the sort of sales area, and then in about the mid '80s, I found this thing called the channel. And I didn't know what it was. IBM had recently gotten into the PC space and had what we called back then a dealer network,
Right.
and we were building out this channel. And I thought, well, that looks pretty interesting. I think I might like to try that. And so I did. So I became a dealer account rep or channel account manager. They call them a lot of different things now.
Sure.
And basically kind of progressed from there. I ended up as the VP for the IBM PC business, running global channels. That was my last job. I left IBM in about 2005, and I went to work for a company called Juniper Networks, and I ran global channels for Juniper Networks, and I also had a little bit of the direct business, which is always good to have, by the way. When you're on the channel side, it's always good to understand the entire go-to-market, motion.
Sure.
So I spent 7 years at Juniper. Great 7 years. We had a very good run, very good growth run. And then I kind of toyed with retirement, and Dell was looking to continue to ramp their entry into the channel because for years, they had sort of been the anti-channel.
Yeah,
But
B2C,
frankly,
big B2C, right?
yeah, big B2C, but also big direct to, everybody.
Yeah.
But on a friend of mine, a guy that I had frankly hired at IBM years ago, named Greg Davis, was running the Dell channel and doing a really good job of it. I joined them as the Americas channel leader because at that point I'd kind of gotten a little tired of the global travel and wanted to just kind of focus on running a channel in a geography, and that was good. And I did that for 3 years. It was a very good run. I helped Dell sort of transition to a two-tier model because for a while they really didn't have a two-tier model, and so that was probably the most significant aspect of that role for me and for them, I think. And then I spent a couple of years running a solution provider. And so about $140 million player that was predominantly, kind of hardware oriented, like many of them,
Mhm.
but making the transition. So, we had about 20% of our business was an MSP business. About another 10, 15 was professional services. But that was a really good learning experience because even though in all the years I spent in the channel, I was on the vendor side. I thought I knew the solution provider side, but you really don't know it until you're in it and until you're running one. So that was good. And then I kind of retired, did a little consulting here or there, and then I got called one day by the CEO at the time, the CEO of Ingram, who wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming and running the GTDC, which is the Global Technology Distributor Council.
Yes.
So, and here I am. And that whole journey, I went through it pretty quickly. It was 40 years probably, something like that.
Let's not get into that. But
Yeah.
actually, because we have you here, and you have such vast experience, and you have been able to see the evolution of the distribution itself, like from the very start, from those days at IBM, how has channel distribution evolved since that day up until now?
Yeah. It's it's kind of interesting. Back then there wasn't any. Back then there was obviously component distributors and distributors that but there really wasn't anything close to what we know today. In fact, I would argue IBM was one of the companies that helped drive it and help build it because, as I recall, IBM was the first major vendor to appoint distributors to sell PC products back in the day. But it's incredible evolution, and it really goes to the credit. The credit goes to the distributors. They've done an amazing job over the years of morphing their business to keep up with what's happening in the marketplace, particularly from a technology standpoint. But to give you an example, when I really first started getting engaged with distribution, which was probably in the 80s, mid 80s or so, early to mid 80s, we essentially used distributors as a bank and a warehouse. That's what we used them for. We needed the financing, right? And we needed some place for product to go to get disseminated and shipped out to somewhere else. And the evolution since then has been incredible. In fact, at GTDC, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do at GTDC in a bit, but at GTDC, one of the papers we wrote about 3 years ago was entitled Distribution 2025. And we did it back in 2019. And what it was intended to do was to talk about where distribution had come from and the evolution of distribution during the phases in the marketplace, and where distribution is going. Right. And in that, we talked about the fact that, back in the beginning, it was, as I said, a bank and a warehouse. And then other things started to evolve, pre-sales support, post-sales support, international sales and, support activities, and just, an incredible amount of services and support activities that frankly were driven, kind of tops down by the vendor community who needed the distributors to step up and be able to do that, but also bottoms up by the distributor customers, the solution providers who basically, needed that kind of activity. And I'll tell you, having worked for a solution provider, we didn't make major investments in infrastructure and in, those types of things. So the most significant thing that the distributors have done is they've built basically a set of capabilities that is 40 years in the making, that essentially allows them to enable a solution a customer, a vendor, to go to market at scale. Yes. And they've developed the processes to enable that. And that's not easy to do. And as you look at what's happened in the marketplace over the last 30 years or so to where we are today, they've continued to evolve that to where now, if you look at the support that they're providing in the cloud space, if you look at what's happening with, and we'll probably talk about as a service and consumption models and things like that, because those are very significant factors. If you look at all of that, the distributors have basically been able to morph their business to support that, to where now hardware is still an essential part of what happens in the marketplace, but it's by far not the most significant, and certainly not the area that's growing, the most
Yeah.
dramatically.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you very much for that. It definitely adds some color, and maybe for some of our listeners, gives them a little bit more of understanding where distribution has really started and how it has evolved over the years. So you mentioned that you received a call where you were trying to retire to join and run the Global Technology Distribution Council. So could you tell us what is the actual role and the mission and the mission of GTDC?
Yeah, sure. So we're a nonprofit, essentially trade organization. Um, we got started about 20 years ago. I was on the vendor side when it got started, and was one of the vendors that contributed to helping it get going and growing. And essentially, the distributors at the time decided that they needed an association to talk about and educate the market on what they did. Because if you think about it, 20, 25 years ago, IT distribution wasn't in the forefront. A lot of the companies were not public companies. Some of the bigger ones were, Ingram Micro at the time, Tech Data, Synex, Arrow. They were not public companies. The public markets didn't really know what they did. And so they created this role. And essentially, our role, what we do is we educate the marketplace on what distribution does. And as part of that, we try to ensure that people understand the value that distribution provides, and to some degree influence folks, relative to what they do. Now, in terms of the overall go-to-market strategy, Magic, it hasn't changed very much in 15, 20 years. It's a hybrid model, and a certain part of it is going to be direct. Most vendors have some direct.
Yeah.
Even the ones that tell you they don't deliver directly still have direct influence, right?
Yeah.
And still identify customers and the opportunities from a direct standpoint. There's single tier, that exists, and then there's two tier. And what's happened over the years, frankly, is that to a large degree, some of what the distributors provide gets taken for granted. So, when I talked about, distribution provides a bank and a warehouse for folks, most people look at that and say, oh, yeah, that's an old guy who's been in the industry forever, who's talking about what distribution did 30 years ago. Okay, I'll give you that. But the next question I would ask is, could you replace that? Or how would you replace that as a vendor? And trust me, the vendors I've worked for have tried to, either replace it or do it on their own. And it's irreplaceable because of what I described of, the investment over the years that's been made in the evolution in the support and the capabilities, which is only getting more significant, by the way. And I'll talk about that in a minute because I want folks to understand the future of distribution and where it's going. So our role is to talk about it. So what we do is we create white papers, research papers. We do about 3 a year, and we'll talk about, for example, distribution's role in sustainability, which is a big topic. Clearly, in Europe, it's a very big topic. The EU is all over that. What are the distributors doing? How are they doing it? In fact, I've got a big project going on, in that area. That was a paper we did, last year. We've got an innovation report coming out here in the next 2 months, which talks about what are the innovative technology trends in the marketplace that are upon us, and what's distribution doing to help their customers and their vendors, in those spaces. We also did one at the end of last year, which was really important, which talked about the point I was on, which was the sort of the economic value and the economics of distribution. Because a lot of people would tell you, every company I've worked with people would tell you, Yeah, but we pay for distribution. Of course you do. You pay for anything that has any value, right?
Yeah.
Um, but the key point is understanding what it is that the distributors provide, and more importantly, what's the value of that? And if you didn't have it, could you replace it? And could you replace it, easily, cost effectively, etc.? So you had an old report that describes that. So that's one of the things we do. We do some podcasts also about once every 3 weeks. I'll interview some, senior executive from the industry. Doesn't just not just distributors, but I talk to folks in the vendor community. I talk to folks, in the ancillary areas. Like for example, we've got a summit coming up in Europe in June in Amsterdam, and we've got a guest speaker, a futurist, and so I'll interview him before the event, and he'll be on my podcast.
Hmm.
So we do that. Um, we hold events, which is probably the most significant thing. They're tremendous networking events, and so they're not huge from the standards of traditional IT events because the audience tends to be the vendor community and distributors. So we don't typically have solution providers join us, um, and they're great events. We have really good guest speakers, but the networking piece of it is really good because it enables 40 or 50 vendors to get with 15 or 20 distributors, and all those meetings that take place would
Yeah.
typically take a year to get done, and we get them done in 2 days, right?
Yeah, despite the advancement of the technology and that you can speak to anybody, you know, over the internet, just like we are doing today, it still cannot replace that human interaction, right? And that meeting physically in the space, reading each other's body language and everything else that goes with it. These are conversations are definitely more meaningful, and can definitely aid towards a successful partnership. It is, I mean, partnerships. It's based on relationship, right? I mean,
Totally.
it's not something that you do over the internet. You just sign a contract and that's that.
Yeah.
Putting a face to a name and understand each other and each other's goals, etc. That plays a huge role, and done in person is so much not only easier but so much more meaningful.
It is. In fact, if you talk to our constituents, which is primarily the vendor community, that is our constituent. But if you talk to them, and if you talk to our members, who basically I work for, they would tell you that out of all the things we do, that's the most significant is the networking events and the ability to bring people together for a couple of days in a room with some meaningful content, but the ability to have some dialogue, talk about what's going on, understand each other's goals and what's happening for either the given year or whatever time frame is interesting. That's the number one value. The last thing we do though, which is also really important, is we have relationships with um, some pretty significant market intelligence companies in both North America and in Europe. And essentially, what happens is um, those companies gather up the POS data from either the GTDC companies or even companies that aren't part of GTDC, but they gather up the POS data, then they develop reports from that. And those reports, generally provide an incredible amount of information relative to volumes, by category, by type, et cetera. And then those reports get, built out, generated. They call them a distribution tracker, and then they get sold to the vendor community. And the vendors use those reports to build volumes, understand trends, understand
Mhm.
market share, et cetera. Our two European partners are a company called GFK out of Germany and Context. And we've had relationships with those folks for years. And in North America, we work with IDC. And we hold webinars. So, in fact, yesterday we had webinars with both of them, separately, of course. And we talked about the first quarter and what went on in the first quarter and what were the trends and what do we see happening in the second quarter and why, and et cetera. And so that's also pretty valuable to our constituents.
No, absolutely. Otherwise, they only see the view of their own world, right? They don't know. They don't see what's happening. Either over over the big water, or actually what's happening in the industry as a whole. Because I mean, we all stuck in our daily jobs and try to do the best we can for the company we are with. But to understand those trends definitely has a huge impact on the future of the business. Um, and there's, you mentioned earlier about as a service,
Mm.
and obviously the cloud computing and software as a service must have had impact on the IT distribution, right? On the landscape as a whole, and also how distributors behave. Because I can recall a multitude of conversations that I had with SaaS providers, and the majority of them would say, no, distribution definitely not for us. This isn't something that we would use distributor for. So how do you see it? How has that changed, and how have distributors adapted to as a service offering?
Yeah. Well, the reason it's changed or changing, right, is because it's not as simple as a simple SaaS offering. In other words, if there's a simple SaaS offering that was on the forefront of the digital transformation, um, that required a one-on-one relationship, you could argue, well, why do I need somebody else involved in that, right? And my response would be, you probably don't, right? But what's changed is, if you look at the transition to infrastructure as a service, and what's happening with the consumption models, the truth is that there is no one vendor solution that can solve customer problems. In fact, typically it's seven or eight that
Yeah.
that are solving customer problems. Well, so when I look at that, what I begin to do is I call that an ecosystem, right? Because what's required today in the marketplace, and you're going to hear more and more about this. In fact, this will be the next most overused word in the industry, I think, will be ecosystem, right? For a lot of
I
digital
think it already
transformation,
is. I think it
right?
already is. Yeah.
Probably is, exactly. But the reality is it's true, right? When you go look at it and you say, okay, I guess there is, because you got all these folks in the system working toward delivering an outcome for a customer, for an end user. Well, the role that distribution is playing is somebody has to orchestrate all of that activity, right? In other words, that just doesn't happen. There's still work associated with that. So, give you an example of the consumption model. It's not as simple as, yeah, I'm just going to go to market with one company. I'll work directly with that company. Everything gets transferred. The licensing will happen. We'll turn on the billing, and everything will flow smoothly. Well, guess what? Now multiply that times 6, and then multiply that times every one of them has a different start date. Every one of them has a different methodology. Everyone has a different process. Oh, by the way, do their products work with each other? Has anybody done integration testing? Has anybody figured out? And so you start stepping back and you realize, well, who's going to do that? Well, the only entity in the marketplace that has the capability to do that are the distributors, because they touch all the pieces, right, of it. And and there are plenty of vendors who over the years have tried to go to market, directly, and what they discover is, yeah, great, I could be reasonably effective in getting some of that to market, but how does my solution come together at the customer? And so that's the role that distribution is now playing. I think what's causing confusion, honestly, Magic, a little bit, and it's work that still needs to be worked out, is everybody now has a platform to try to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or a marketplace. The hyperscalers have a marketplace, AWS and GCS and Microsoft, they got a marketplace. The vendors have a marketplace, because some vendors have product that lend itself to being sold through a marketplace, right?
Yeah.
The distributors have a marketplace, and now people are starting to look and say, well, how does all that come together? I don't understand the various model, and that, I'd be the first to tell you, is evolving, right? and it is not solved. It's like, to me, it's like cloud was 10 years ago when everybody was trying to figure out, well, cloud's coming. We got this. How does it work? How am I going to make money at it? What's my role? The same scenario right now is evolving. But what I would tell you is if you look at what many of the distributors are doing, they're building platforms that enable all of that and also pull in directly the platforms and the capabilities of their vendor partners, and then their solution providers have capabilities. And those platforms essentially do a couple of things. Obviously, you can transact business, on those platforms. You can do marketing and marketing-like activities on the platforms. But to me, the most significant part of the platforms ultimately will be there's going to be data and information that's included in those platforms. So when you're a solution provider and you've been selling to a given customer for 5 years, there's a good chance that you really don't have an outstanding handle on exactly what's installed, when it was installed, what's the refresh cycle, what's the opportunity. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to partner with somebody who could give you that? And by the way, give you that in a way that is not going to compete with you, which is exactly what the role, Disty plays. So long-winded answer, but there's just so much beyond just the simple transaction. And if anything, Magic, the marketplace is more complicated than it's ever been, particularly with the proliferation of security services and security requirements, right? Cybersecurity requirements. And so the role that Disty plays is actually evolving and becoming more important than less important, even in light of the transition to consumption models, et cetera. That's my view.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think there's still, especially companies who are new, they're the startups, the scale ups, and now they recognize the fact that they do need channel to scale even more. They sometimes forget that, channel or distribution, the channel as a whole, is not only about the transaction. It's not about bringing the customer in, just signing the paperwork and then issuing a license or provisioning an environment. There's so much more that needs to happen, all the way from the pre-sale cycle to the sales cycle to the post-sale, right? Because that's where the services are typically being provided, where the adoption happens. And it's rarely a vendor who actually drives adoption. It's the partners, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other thing, one other point that's really important here that gets overlooked a little bit in this discussion, but I lived it, so I can tell you about it. One of the things that's happening is because of the transition to an as-a-service model, it's completely changing the business model of the solution providers and their ability to run their business and manage cash flow. Because if you think about the way they used to do business, right? And it was pretty simple. You have a customer engagement. Typically the terms were net 30, maybe net 60, depending on, the customer. You do a big transaction, you get paid, you've got all your, your COGS set up, all your SG&A, all your business model set up for that kind of a model. Now, all of a sudden, that same transaction, you're getting paid 1/36th, a month, all right?
Yeah.
1/36th of the total. If it's a 3-year deal, 160 if it's a 5-year deal, or it's variable based on usage. And so you've got to adjust your entire business model. And there's a lot of solution providers out there that need help doing that. And some of it's as simple as I need some financing, I need some floor planning that a Disty can provide me, along with a level of expertise and advice on how do I do this? How do I make this transition? That's something that all the distributors are now doing, right? Again, it sounds so simple because it's so fundamental, but it's so fundamental that if it doesn't get done properly, solution providers go out of business.
Yeah,
That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
that is huge. Yeah, and I read it quite recently, definitely beginning of this year. And one of the distributors was talking about how they have become more of a financing platform for their partners
Yep.
than they are a distributor anymore. Um, because the market has changed so much with the introduction of SaaS, recurring revenue, and everything that goes with it.
Yeah.
They basically became like, a financer of the of the customer's purchase via a partner.
Well, a lot of the distributors I work with would tell you that the term distribution really doesn't accurately portray what they do, right? I mentioned the term ecosystem orchestration or ecosystem orchestrator. Doesn't roll off your tongue, so it's not, it's probably not going to get any legs. But you think about it that way, and that's how I think about it. Is they're orchestrating a bunch of different things. Financing happens to be one of them.
Yeah, perfect. I had two questions that I had prepared in advance to ask you, but I think we went through them in terms of what how channel distribution is changing, right, and where it's going. We did touch on the marketplaces and how that all is evolving, but then how can companies leverage technology to say optimize their strategy when it comes to channel distribution. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there's a couple things. One is, I think first you figure out you go to market strategy, right?
Yeah,
And as I mentioned earlier, the obvious thing is people start out with a direct to customer, which makes sense in terms of early adoption, those types of things. But if you're going to get any scale, you then have to recognize you got to use a channel, particularly globally. There's no debate, right? Um, and so, in terms of how to optimize it, I think the way I would think about it is you can't kind of fake your way into the channel. Well, what I mean by that is, I got a company that's built. I got a set of products that are built, to go direct to set of customers, and I'm going to just kind of transition and ask the channel to help me go to market. Well, you just can't do that. You've got to build a set of channel programs, a set of channel offerings, set of channel capabilities. You got to train a channel, and that's how you optimize, you go to market. And companies get there eventually, but there are times when they sort of just try to ease their way into it and don't recognize, no, it takes an investment. Now, the investment will pay off, but you got to make it.
yeah. What I often hear when I have discussions with channel people and on vendor size particularly is if you have the lack of buy-in at the very top level,
Yeah.
you're just not going to succeed. You're gonna be hit with failure over failure over failure. Yes, you're going to learn a lot from it, but unless you get that buy-in from the whole company and you change the culture a little bit as well, only then you will start seeing some results. um, I mean, partners want to work with partners, right? I mean, for them the vendor is the partner, and it has to be, a lot of the people I spoke with, they call it's a two-way street. There has to be traffic going both ways, investment from both sides, right? Otherwise it's not a true partnership. You can't just expect, because we have a contract signed, for the partner to go out there and start selling on your behalf.
Yeah, one of the things that I typically do when I talk to people about this, and I used to do when I was, running channels for three different companies, is study how do your competitors go to market, right? In other words, the folks that you want to beat, you want to compete with, how do they go to market? And what you'll just and so the point of that is the real message of that is there's nothing new here. We'll have people kind of come into the industry that were very successful doing whatever they were doing, and then they'll look at the go to market model and IT and say, oh, why don't we do it this way? And after a while, you realize, no, there's a way that it has to be done, and it's got to be done properly. It ultimately becomes a hybrid model, by the way, which typically reflects the overall, marketplace volumes with, 70% of the, product going through a channel, the other 30 is direct, and within the 70, some is direct to VAR, but most of it's through two-tier disti. But the trick is not that. The trick is, how do you create a compelling set of programs and offerings to support the folks that are out there, and recognize that you got to train them, you got to enable them. And to your point, you got to have the entire company bought in, because if you don't have, for example, it's obvious, top level CEO, CFO, but if you don't have the product management teams bought in, and they don't understand that when I build a product, it's going to be delivered through my set of partners. So I got to create training capabilities and things of that nature. It won't work. So it really is, you got to have a comprehensive view and a comprehensive strategy. One of the things that we do at GTDC is we work with a consultant called Bashan Ventures, who works very closely with the Silicon Valley PEs, private equity groups, and,
Yes.
and investors in startups. And so a lot of the startups, early stage startup companies, when they start thinking about go to market, we try to ensure that they understand what the model looks like and where disti plays in that. And generally they have a two-tier model in mind early on. And it makes sense.
And we had Joe Callahan actually
Yeah.
on the podcast before. We
Yeah.
did speak a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yep.
In terms of your maybe 2 or 3 tips for anyone thinking about starting their channel go-to-market journey, what would your recommendations be? And would you recommend them to start with distributors?
Yeah, I would. And the reason I would actually, the two pieces that become fairly obvious to me are, one, I've got some level of direct, to customer, and it's either direct touch or it's actually, some business that I can actually transact directly. And that's always going to be in place with any vendor, and it's actually, not a bad thing, right? But in terms of going to market, you got to go through the channel. And the reason you start with distribution is ultimately you got to create a network of partners, solution providers that can get you there. But if you're a startup and you're just getting started, you don't know who those are.
Yeah.
You don't know who has the expertise. You don't know who has the skill set. You don't know who's successfully in that space. The distributors do. And so what ends up happening is you end up relying on, as you begin your journey, the distributor to help you build out that go-to-market strategy. And part of that assistance is the identification of who are the partners in the ecosystem that I ought to be working with, right? And so that's kind of where it starts. Then the next piece of it is they can really help with, what are the kinds of things you have to do, right? So there are some jacks or better types of things, right? You got to have a program in place of some sort. You have to have an incentive program, right? You got to understand what's my competitors doing. So if I'm if I'm an entry level player and I'm in the network as a service space, just to pick one, who's in that space today? Who's successful? What are they doing? How are they doing? You need that kind of an intelligence. You can get that, through working with, distribution. And the last piece is that really becomes, I think, underestimated by a lot of folks, because particularly some startups get enamored with, this whole notion of, well, maybe I can go to market through hyperscalers and maybe I can figure out a way. And by the way, the work the hyperscalers are doing are terrific, and they're partnering quite a bit with distribution also. We see that all the time because they're building out their network, and they need what distribution does as well as anybody. But the one thing that everybody has to remember, no debate, is if you're a company, solution providers, distribution from day one has been very, very consistent with how they go to market. They go to market through their solution providers, and they drag customer, vendor product, into that space. They're not competing with them. They're an adjacent sort of set of capabilities for the marketplace. That's really important for folks to understand. So, yes, I would recommend strongly that they do that.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much. We could talk for hours, if not more. I would love to get you back and maybe concentrate on. There's so much detail when it comes to the distribution. Just like we had a conversation earlier, I would like to get you back on the podcast at the near future and maybe concentrate on one single detail and maybe go through that a little bit more. I think that would be very valuable for our listeners. There's one question that I always ask of every single guest, and that's, what's the one thing you wish you knew when you started your career in channel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what I would tell you is it would be the significance of sort of the disruptive technology and how that disruptive technology was going to change the world, and figure out, if you wanted to, how to become part of that, right? Because I mean, think about it. When I started back in the, I hate to admit it, but early 70s at IBM, I was on the forefront of, the PC revolution. Well, the operating system was a disruptive technology back then, right? I didn't recognize it as such, right? I mean, it's just kind of, networking was a disruptive technology, cloud certainly as we go forward. But so I think for folks that are starting out, is to watch for those disruptive technologies. And if you really want a big time successful career, for whatever that means for people, some means different things for different people, but follow the disruptive technologies because they typically will change the game. And it's happened over and over again, and it's going to happen again probably.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for educating me and possibly some of our listeners as well on the ins and outs of the distribution. We wish you all the best with the event in June in Holland, and we hope to speak with you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode. I do hope you found it valuable, and if you did, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review. You can also follow Channel Voices Podcast on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, or just visit channelvoices.com where you can send me a message or leave a voicemail. All of the links are listed in the show notes, and once again, I appreciate you tuning in today. Until next time.